World War II is a well-documented conflict, and many of the shameful acts committed in the course of violence have been discussed, researched, and analyzed many times over. However, this does not mean that every stone has been overturned or that each instance of violence has been acknowledged. The Holocaust was the defining act of horror which most retrospectives center on, as the rise of the Nazis to power and the ensuing systematic murder of Jewish people remains awful in both its conception and execution. Although Jewish people were the main targets of the Holocaust, stories of other victimized groups have received coverage as well, from sources that note that the disabled were the first to be targeted, to the paltry recognition of the treatment of homosexuals, many of whom remained imprisoned after the war. However, few own the treatment of women during this period, is particularly the treatment they faced as a result of their sex. Prior to World War II, Germany was quite progressive for its time, especially in the cities. Homosexuality was not necessarily opposed by many. As noted in Women in the Weimar Republic, women began to hold demonstrations for women's suffrage there as early as 1910, and received the vote in 1919. During this period, the majority of the electorate was female, in part because so many men had died in the war or were so physically or psychologically wounded they were unlikely to vote. In 1919, the first year women could vote in Germany, they held 10% of the seats in the Reichstag, and their numbers continued to rise throughout the next decade. The Nazi Party was in opposition to these changes and sought a return to tradition. Nazi gender roles wanted to see women having as many children as possible for the Aryan race. Prior to the rise of the Nazi Party, women were entering the workforce and going against many traditional gender norms. As a result, the Nazis' ideal woman was one that stayed in the domestic sphere, maintained the home, supported her husband, and created new life to sustain the empire. In fact, Nazi ideology barred them from medicine, law, and civil service. The party awarded a state and civil decoration, a brilliant cross presented with a ribbon to wear around the neck, called the Ehrenkreuz der Deutschen Mutter, or a cross of honor of the German mother. Bronze went to eligible mothers of 4 or 5 children, silver for those of 6 or 7, and gold to those with 8 or more kids. There were even schools to train women into these perfect wives, which of course imposed the importance of raising their kids under Nazi ideology. By the time the war drew to a close, with Allied forces invading Germany and then later occupying it, animosities were high, not just between opposing forces, but directed at civilians as well. It is estimated that at least 860,000 German women and young girls, and also men and boys, were raped at the end of the war and in the post-war period by Allied soldiers and members of the occupying forces. These were perpetuated not by a singular group, but by many, including GIs and Red Army soldiers, British and French, Belgians, Poles, Czechs, and Serbs. These soldiers did not discriminate. As they marched across Europe on their way to Germany, the Americans raped the wives of Allied British and French, and also freed slave laborers and concentration camp inmates. Women were viewed as spoils of war, as rape appears to still be tacitly regarded as a byproduct of the legitimate use of force in wars. This was well known at the time, as at the start of 1945, most Germans had ominous presentiments about the occupation by the Allied troops. They knew, or at least had an idea, of what German troops that had done elsewhere and feared retribution. This idea was partially fear-mongering and held a racist slant, as there was a view that darker-skinned or Soviet soldiers would be worse and more animalistic than American, British, or French forces, but it was also true. With most able-bodied men employed in the war, 60% of the waiting German population was extremely vulnerable, and comprised of women and children, the elderly, and those unfit for service. Because of the widely circulated view that losing Germany would also mean losing the women, alongside a belief of total defeat, many women committed suicide to escape the violence that was to come. Those who fled only found themselves more vulnerable as the Allied forces entered Germany, but those who remained fared no better. While there was no Soviet order to rape German women, armies implicitly supported doing so, as there was not punishment for doing so. Even if German women chose to report the crime, local police could not investigate or prosecute. Many chose not to report or talk about their experiences even after occupation ended due to Cold War alliances, the ensuing injury to male pride from being unable to protect female family members, and general misconceptions about rape. The onslaught of rapes after the war remains a touchy subject, and one which is not acknowledged nearly enough, even as it stands apart from systematic rapes committed in other conflicts due to the sheer number committed in Germany. This is in great part due to German women being viewed as wrong victims, as they may have supported Nazi crimes, were on the losing side, and were often blamed for the victimization. Those who attempted to make the experience somewhat easier were viewed as traitors who willingly slept with the enemy for personal gain, even as many women volunteered to save their families from injury or death. No woman was safe, as it was noted that women of all types were raped, including the very young and old, illustrating that this was not based purely on desire, but was done as a show of power. Men and boys were also victimized. During the period of 1945 to 1955, the abuse continued. While most victims are dead and there are few first-hand accounts, there are several testimonies regarding this period. This may be difficult to hear, and I recommend caution. However, I also believe it to be important to hear first-hand accounts that illustrate the brutality and highlight an important truth regarding men in power. To commit a crime, a person must have the desire, ability, and opportunity to do so. War often provides all three. Additionally, rape is rarely just about sex. In the case of the rape of Berlin, the rapes by the Soviets were symbols for the overthrow of the German Reich. It was meant to instill shame and to illustrate victory and dominance. Thoughts for what they were doing to other human beings just wasn't there. Our first testimony comes from Betty Kay. That evening, the engineer's wife, Betty Kay, was roused by loud knocking at the corridor door. When she opened the door, her 18-month child in her arms, she was confronted by two Negro soldiers, who pushed her aside and entered the apartment. After they had turned all the rooms upside down, they assaulted the woman and, according to her own statement, raped her 3 times. The woman's father was restrained the whole time by one of the Negroes and then shot to death. From Robert Albert's diary. Leonie Bilias, from her diary, reads, "He grabbed hold of me and dragged me towards the door. I tried to escape, struggled desperately. My mother attempted to come to my aid and pull me from him. He pushed her away and opened the door. It led to the bathroom. Mother tried to come in as well. He slammed the door shut and bolted it. He was out of his mind and tried to pull my trousers down, but couldn't undo the fastening. He pulled out a knife. I screamed. Now he's going to stab you, I thought. Mother hammered on the door from the outside and also screamed. The soldier cut the belt with the knife and pulled off my trousers and underwear. Then he forced me down to the stone floor. I hit my head. He threw himself on top of me. I was frozen and didn't even scream anymore. But my mother continued to moan all the time behind the door. I don't think it lasted very long. He stood up and left the bathroom and house without a word. I squatted on the cold floor and just wanted to crawl away into a corner. Mother came in, took me in her arms, and comforted me. We were both crying." Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a pro-Russian resistance fighter, noted in her diary, "The victorious army set upon the women of Berlin with uninhibited avidity. We visited Hannelore Thiel, Hilke's friend and classmate. She was huddled up on her couch. She barely looked up as we entered the room. I want to kill myself, she wept. I can't live like this. Was it really so bad? I asked cautiously. She looked at me miserably. 7, she grimaced. 7 in succession, like animals." One has to wonder why rape is acknowledged as a common aspect of war, and perhaps an unavoidable one, and yet so rarely discussed openly or accurately. It is feared and yet viewed as inevitable. Women die to avoid this fate, and yet only men are discussed in terms of losses regarding war, PTSD, and death. And so rarely is the horrible and lingering reality of women the focus. It suggests that this is innate, that there is no avoiding men harming women under these circumstances. Truthfully, I think the most honest conclusion is that men don't wish to avoid becoming rapists if they are given sufficient justification to do so. This, dear viewers, is where I part. This is primarily based on the book by Miriam Gebhardt, titled Crimes Unspoken, The Rape of German Women at the End of the Second World War. It was translated in 2017, so it's relatively recent, and I didn't even read some of the worst testimonies in there. There were cases of them entering a town, rounding up all the women into stalls, and then just essentially raping them to death. And these are things that happen not just by all the bad guys, not just by the Soviets, but all the soldiers. Every type of soldier. They targeted German women because they were the bad guys. And no one really admitted to this. In the same way that Japan really hasn't apologized for the comfort women issue, or the rape of Nanking, or any of these other issues, America isn't going to apologize for this. Neither is the Soviet Union or any other country involved. Even if it's a well-known secret, no one's going to admit to it or apologize. And that is increasingly just, it's disturbing, it's oppressing, and in the context of several wars and conflicts going on right now, I fear so greatly for the women in those areas. because it's never, women aren't the ones who are typically fighting the wars. Women aren't the ones who are typically in the government and therefore in charge of starting the wars. And yet women are the ones who are going to face being raped by up to 50 men at a time, as happened in Berlin. Anyhow, if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.